Today is October 9th, 2025. Welcome to another session of the Will Work for Food Project and the New Possibilities Hour, started by Natalie Armstrong Matan and co-hosted by myself, David Schraga, Jeff Kitchhaven, Jean Lawler, and our colleague Michael Schwimmer. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It's always so nice to see so many familiar faces who join us on a week-to-week basis. Uh, as many of you know, these fantastic programs are free. They are the result of the work of our volunteers as well as our speakers who volunteer our time. And they are designed in order to help try and raise food for local food banks and donations, I should say, for local food banks around the world. Um, One of our favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce the running total. And it is my pleasure to tell you that so far we have been informed of donations totaling $881,338.83 so far. So we are just tremendously grateful to our audience and to our speakers and our supportive community. We are on our way to $1 million, and it's really just such a fantastic result and such a wonderful thing for everyone to be a part of. So thank you very much for your time. Um, Today we have a fantastic program for you that I'm extremely excited about. I think it's such an important topic for mediators, lawyers, and anyone who negotiates. The title of our program today is The Nuts and Bolts of Negotiating with Emotional Intelligence. Our speaker is Rhonda Muir, who is the founder and principal of Law People Management LLC, and she is a leading authority on lawyer personalities and the application of behavioral science to the practice of law. Rhonda draws from years of experience as a lawyer in New York big law, which is, as we know, a significant environment to practice in when it comes to emotional intelligence, and as inside counsel for a privately held conglomerate in Paris, France, and as vice president of the CPR Institute for Dispute Resolution. She offers individual practitioners and workplace managers business savvy, psychologically sophisticated, and real world solutions to both traditional and emerging challenges unique to the legal industry and to its professionals. She specializes in getting lawyers invested in their careers, motivated, productive, profitable, and leading effectively. She is nationally recognized for her early identification of critical industry trends. She's a frequent speaker, an award-winning author, and publishes the lawpeopleblog.com, a valuable resource for the legal community. Um, Rhonda's best-selling book, Beyond Smart Lawyering with Emotional Intelligence, which I have a copy of here, is maybe she'll show it. It's a fantastic book that I've really enjoyed. Beyond Smart Lawyering with Emotional Intelligence. It's published by the American Bar Association, and it's the first comprehensive guide to understanding, using, and raising emotional intelligence in the unique context of the practice of law. The recently released second edition reflects breaking research addressing, among other issues, increased disengagement, fallout from the COVID pandemic, the challenges of AI, and the advantages that emotional intelligence brings to 21st century lawyers and the legal workplace. The topic of Rhonda's presentation today is the nuts and bolts of the negotiating with emotional intelligence, as I mentioned. She describes what she'll be speaking about today this way. Negotiation isn't just about having the sharpest facts or the strongest demand. It's about connecting with clarity, courage, and compassion. In this seminar, Rhonda walks you through the framework for negotiating from the inside out, blending a legal strategy with emotional insight so you can reach agreements that are strong, sustainable, and satisfying for all parties. Imagine negotiation as constructing a finely tuned machine. Every bolt, hinge, and gear must align. If one piece is loose, a misunderstood emotion, a suppressed concern, an unchecked bias, the whole mechanism can grind or fail. This session will give you the wrench and the blueprint to tighten all those parts so your negotiation engine runs smoothly. And as you know, I mentioned, we ask our audience if they're inclined and so able to donate to a food bank. And the food bank that Rhonda has designated for you to consider today is Samaritan's Purse. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Rhonda and ask you, Rhonda, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the organization. And thank you again so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here working for food. Samaritan's Purse is one of my favorites because I think they're sort of on the spot very early on. So that's why I endorse them and donate to them and encourage those who are inclined to do so to do that. Um, I'd like to give just a short overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to stop 2 or 3 times for questions. But first, we're going to talk about emotional intelligence, what it is. And I sort of need to do that so you have a full understanding. We're only going to hit highlights, but the full understanding of what that term means, both physically and mentally. Then we're going to talk about emotional intelligence and lawyers, as to which there is specific research, interestingly enough. And then we'll talk about emotional intelligence and negotiation and mediation specifically. Um, so to start out with, intelligence. Um, I think the simplest answer is it's the ability to make emotions work for you instead of against you. There's a compound noun, emotional intelligence, and it's spot on because it combines emotions with cognitive intelligence. That's the two things that are combined in emotional intelligence. This does not mean, as some people say, that you're kind or you're soft or you're nice. That's not what it means. Emotional intelligence is morally neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It depends on what you use those skills for. It's a very young science. It was first researched and presented in 1990 by Peter Salovey and John Muir, who were psychologists at Yale. Daniel Goleman took that research and ran with it and published a book, Why Emotional Intelligence Can Matter More Than IQ. There are now over 50,000 scholarly papers written about emotional intelligence, so it's no longer undiscovered or young. All right, let's see why it's not moving. Hmm. David, there we go.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay, sorry about that. So let's look at it physiologically. Um, Again, we're combining the neocortex, which is where cognitive thinking goes on, with the amygdala, which is considered the emotional brain, the oldest part of the brain, which connects directly to our fight and flight instincts. What happens in the triggers in the amygdala, what happens in the amygdala is 100 times faster than we can think. So it's a very fast um, acting. The thalamus gets sensory messages, and sometimes they're sent to the neocortex, but they're always also copied to the amygdala. So the amygdala is going to act on these sensory things faster than the neocortex. The interesting thing about the amygdala, and some recent research has really pulled this up, is this not only does this include sometimes unconscious memories, emotional memories, but also memories from in utero. And we know that from an Israeli study that showed that women who were pregnant during the Six-Day War ended up having a generation of children with much higher mental illness issues than other children. But not only in utero, but it also contains, and this is quite astounding, experiences that may be from prior generations. And the reasons we believe that is because there's been a lot of research with rats. I have a friend who does this, and they can make a rat avoid a smell, which is there's nothing wrong with it. They just shock them so they avoid the smell. But their children tend to also avoid the smell, as do their grandchildren. So we believe that there's intergenerational trauma that transfers biologically. Um, what I love about this quote, this was from a law student. If I wanted to talk about feelings, I wouldn't have gone to law school. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that feel like that. But what we're going to do is talk about feelings pretty much this whole session. because why they are important. And even though we don't want to talk about feelings, they have a big impact on us. We're going to start with this really important research that was done about Eliot. And Eliot was a lawyer in the 50s, corporate lawyer, very successful, upstate New York. He had an orange-sized tumor, which was successfully removed in his brain. Successfully removed. They did a lot of testing beforehand. They did a lot of testing afterwards. They said, good news, your IQ, your vocabulary, all of your intelligence tests are coming back spot on. The problem was that in about 6 months, he had lost his job, his wife, he was living in his brother's basement. So he went to a guy called Antonio Damasio, who's a very famous neuroscientist, and said, what's going on here? I'm just as intelligent as I used to be. Why am I having all these problems? And he said, well, his research showed that this Eliot's cognitive brain, prefrontal cortex, had been disconnected from his amygdala. So yes, he had IQ, language, all that stuff going for him, but he couldn't make decisions. He couldn't make decisions because it turns out, and Damasio is famous for this, that a lot of your decisions are sort of gut oriented. What our experiences are, what is successful, what works, what doesn't work. So he could argue pro and con on all sorts of things, but he couldn't come to a good decision, a conclusion about that. So it's interesting that this was a lawyer, but what Damasio is saying, you also have to feel. You can't just reason. You have to feel in order to make these good decisions. This is some more research that's very interesting. This was done by a woman named Candace Pert with the National Institute of Mental Health. She discovered that within a second, we produce neurochemical, within a second of a feeling, an emotion, we produce neurochemicals that radiate, and they influence other people with that radiation. It takes about 6 seconds to fully immerse your body in those neurochemicals, and then you radiate. And whether you know it or not, whether you intend to or not, you are influencing people with those radiations. And one of the best examples of this is something called emotional contagion. Yale research put 2 people in a room who don't know each other, and in 2 minutes, they come out with a similar emotional experience. So we know that these emotions can be contagious, and it goes both ways. Other people's emotions can be contagious to you. Once these emotions saturate your body, which takes only 6 seconds, and there's actually an emotional intelligence organization called 6 seconds because that's sort of the time when your emotions are have the most control. They've done a study, which I always think this is sort of interesting, that there's a physiological state associated with most emotions. So you could, we talk about butterflies in your stomach or being hot-headed or cold feet or whatever. So these actually have physiological states that feel differently depending on exactly what emotion you're expressing. But what's most important to lawyers is that these emotions color our judgment. How steep that hill looks depends on your mood. How, for example, if you feel in a good mood, that's not as steep as if you're in a bad mood. The distance depends on your mood. Sound, how strong it is, depends on your mood. Smell depends on your mood. Spiciness of food, attractiveness of other people, unfortunately, depends on your mood. there's a couple of studies. I'm just going to quickly. One is that doctors in a good mood reach a correct diagnosis 20% faster than the ones who are in a bad mood. So our judgment can improve if you're in a good mood, and some bad emotions actually hinder our judgment. Another case, which was very interesting against Yale study, where they had teachers they manipulated teachers' moods. So either they were in a good mood or a bad mood, but over time, they showed them the same written test. The difference in the grading of those tests was an average of 1.5 letter grades. So if you're in a bad mood, you gave the same test, 1.5 lower letter grade, which is sort of striking enough. But on top of that, in a separate questionnaire, 85% of those teachers said that emotion or mood did not affect their judgment of papers. The most striking example of this, perhaps, is again an Israeli study where they had judges who were processing parole applications. That it's 6 minutes at a clip. They did this at 2-hour segments during the day, and while there were 8 judges with individually acting, while the average approval rate was the same, was 35%, watching that approval rate change during those sessions was pretty astonishing. They would go from 100% in some cases down to 35, 65 down to 0, 50 down to 0, so that by the end of their 2-hour session, after which they would be able to have a break, have something to eat, that sort of thing, they found at the end of those sessions, and then worse as the day went on, simply approving or not a parole petition changed dramatically their approval rates. These were not stacked as to more likely to be proved or less. It just showed that things like boredom, hunger, other distractions kept their judgment from being constant. So we know that our emotions, our moods affect our judgment. They also impact our performance. This is called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. You may be familiar with it. There requires a certain amount of stress to even get out of bed in the morning. And then the optimal situation actually has to be carefully managed, because you want to be aware of your emotions, but you also have to manage those emotions, because if you get too stressed, you go over into exhaustion and overload. So it's called flow, this optimal state, but it requires being able to recognize and manage your stress level. So this is the productivity side of it, but the profitability side of it, of being able to manage your emotions, or how emotions impact you, emotional intelligence impact you, is there was a good study of a lot of accountants where they took the highest scoring emotional intelligence accountants who had worked for at least 10 years. And this was a firm of over 50,000 accountants. And they found that group of high emotional intelligence accountants produced profits that were almost 5 times greater than the average partner working for 10 years. So there is a profit association with emotional intelligence. It's not just, again, not that you're necessarily nicer or anything like that. There is productivity and profit associated with higher emotional intelligence. Of course, last is how much emotions affect our physical and mental health. This was a study done by the ABA in Hazleton, where they looked at 15,000 lawyers and came up with these stats, which are not good. Their conclusion was that attorney impairment is profound and far-reaching. But most of these stats relate to an inability to control emotions. So we have clinical anxiety, clinical stress, substance abuse, alcohol, depression. Depression's at 6 times the rate of the general population. Suicidal thoughts and suicide 2 times and higher. Suicide, young men in the United States have the highest suicide level. Young male lawyers have 2.5 times and more the suicide level. So these are emotional crises. That's on top of the physiological crises, because we know that emotional distress has a terrible effect on immunity, on our telomeres, on our lifespan. And right now, loneliness has been identified as worse. The physical impacts and mental impacts are worse than obesity and smoking. And loneliness is something that has really skyrocketed since COVID in all populations, not just talking about lawyers here. So at this juncture, is there somebody or anyone that would like to ask a question? I'm going to try to stop occasionally without, hopefully, anyone would like to ask some questions about so far where we are. Next, we're going to talk about lawyers.
Uh, Rhonda, if I could just jump in, I just wanted to notate just how astounding some of these findings are, and in some sense, maybe perhaps counterintuitive. I mean, you talk about how teachers, 85% of them don't think their judgment is impaired in any way. And yet the studies bear out this concept of emotional radiation. I mean, I thought I was kind of aware of what's going on in the world around me. And it just fascinates me that that is
Mm.
even possible energetically, it sounds like. And I'm sure you'll talk about this more, but within the context of talking to mediators about these things, I would imagine that a lot of this resonates with the audiences that you talk to.
Absolutely. And that contagion, I mean, we could talk about that a lot, but with leaders, talking to leaders, they're sort of known in the literature as the emotional thermostats for their organizations, because one of the things that came out of that Yale study was that the people who are the ones who influence the most the other person in that study were the ones that had the highest standing in the hierarchy and who are most expressive. So leaders who project emotions are going to infect most of their organization. It's very important leadership. All right, lawyers. So what's the deal with lawyers? What's the average lawyer emotional intelligence and IQ? Okay, so our IQ is what we call 2 standard deviations. In other words, between 115 and 130 above norm. But the bad news is our emotional intelligence is in the standard deviation below norm. We are lower than doctors and surgeons. We like to compare ourselves to those kind of accountants, those professions. We are lower as a general matter. It's also lower than the general public. The general public is at 100. So we think about your staff, your witnesses, you know, good chance they might have a higher emotional intelligence than you have. Not you specifically, but us generally. And I would like to point out, these are very general, average, not speaking to anyone specifically. As somebody said, 75% people think they're in the top 25%. So here we are. So where are we falling short? Well, this is what the emotional intelligence skills look like. It's a pyramid. At the bottom is what we call emotional perception, which means can you recognize the emotions in yourself and around you, because those seem to be the same skill. Can you recognize your own emotions? Can you recognize the emotions of those around you? Empathy, can you empathize? And what's very important about the empathy piece is that that phrase, I know how you feel, is actually dependent on the emotional perception piece. If you can't identify your own emotions, then you're not really going to be able to identify someone else's emotions and then say, I share that experience, which is what real empathy, emotional empathy is about. Is I have been in your shoes. So that's the second level. And then emotional understanding, it means things like you can understand what emotions are made of, like disgust is probably hate and anger, so there are very few pure emotions. We have conglomerates of emotions. So that is part of emotional understanding, and also the course of what happens to emotions over time, what happens with irritation and then and annoyance and then anger and then rage, how that proceeds like that. That's emotional understanding. Emotional management is being able to emotionally regulate your own emotions and to use that info and that talent to also manage emotional relationships. Um, but let's talk about these in terms of negotiation. So emotional perception, less than 10% of our communication is in words. 90% is facial expressions, body language, tone, pace, that sort of thing. That's why this is a really important uh, skill. And this is what we call a garbage in, garbage out skill. If for some reason you identify the person you're working with or against as having, let's say, shame, and you start going up this path, well, I understand what's going to happen to that, and this is how I'm going to manage money. If you've misidentified at the bottom, you're not you're lost, because if it's really anger or if it's really some other emotion, your reasoning is going to be off. This is a core ability, perception. Empathy, we know. Oh, sorry, and from negotiation, we have studies that say those who are high in emotional perception are more successful in analyzing the issues that bear, and they actually result in an increase in money gained by the seller. So there's actually a financial association with high emotional perception. Then we could go into empathy. Um, those negotiating with higher emotional empathy usually have better working relations, better brainstorming because of their empathy, and more trust. And a specific study said that not only does your opponent feel more positively about the outcome, regardless of the financial terms, but they're more likely to like you as a negotiator and want to negotiate with you in the future. So that's where the empathy plays in. The understanding piece, um, there's something in emotional intelligence called the oracle effect, and we won't go into that, but it basically says that you have a lot of predictive ability if you have strong emotional understanding. So this is more of an analytical skill, emotional understanding and emotional management. Lawyers tend to do a little better at that. Um, and it means that you have a better idea of how events are going to unscroll, what's going to happen over the course of this negotiation, because you understand the emotional currents and how they progress. And finally, on managing or regulating emotions, the thing that's important about that in negotiation is that emotional regulation means that you can recognize emotions that are inappropriate or counterproductive to the negotiation, and you can eliminate those, suppress those, ignore those, and only focus on those emotions that are strictly related to risk management. So, for example, if you spilled your coffee on the way in and you look a mess, or if you had a squabble with your in-laws the night before, your daughter's not getting into the schools you want, all those situations have to be taken out of the scenario. And people strong in emotional management can do that. There's actually a study that shows that using an MRI, that within the brain, and we talked about those two, the rational part and the emotional brain, that there's often during a negotiation internally between that rational part and the emotional part. The emotional part that says, I want to screw that guy, and the rational part that says, well, at least I'll get this much, and I don't want to lose this amount of money, even if I don't like this guy. So there's an internal um, negotiation going on that you have to also emotionally manage. The other thing that I'd like to say here quickly, people ask about this. Women tend to have a little higher emotional empathy than men, not much. Men tend to have a little higher emotional understanding, emotional management than women. Again, not much. There's not much gender differences, although we could talk about that a lot. The thing that's very important here is that what are lawyers worse at in these four? Anybody? What's our well-documented weakest skill, which accounts for our lower emotional intelligence average? It's the bottom one, emotional perception, the most important one. If you get that wrong, you're gonna have trouble with all the rest of them. So let's just do a real quick. Um, the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, who we know is a comedian, his cousin is, in truth, a psychologist at Cambridge, and he came up with this assessment called reading emotions in the eyes, which lawyers, as a general matter, don't do very well in. It's 36 questions. You can take it online. I'm going to show you a few just as an example. Um, and it's to see how well you can read expressions, the emotional content of facial expressions, which is only one part of communication, but it's an interesting part. Because misperceived emotions, and we again won't go into all of this, can underlie a lot of issues in law firms, in relationships. So here's one. So what do you think? Aghast, baffled, distrustful, terrified. You have to do it quickly. Distrustful is the correct answer. Here's another one. Contented, apologetic, defiant, curious. Quickly. Don't want your prefrontal cortex working here. You want your amygdala. It's defiant. Ashamed, confident, joking, dispirited, confident. Despondent, relieved, shy, excited, despondent. Now, I don't know how you did. I mean, this is 4 out of 36. And of course, there's issues about this assessment, which is fairly old, but we found there's no gender, no race, no other types of anomalies. But this gives you an idea of that very critical skill of emotional perception, and that lawyers are not so good at it. Some lawyers are. Some lawyers are very good at this, but some aren't. So let me stop here. Anybody have questions or comments about what we've done so far about lawyers and emotional intelligence?
I'll ask one more question, Rhonda. You talked about emotional management, and we often hear the term compartmentalization with sort of a negative connotation, I think. What is the difference in your mind of those two types of terms?
Well, compartmentalization, when it can work for you. For example, a different type of term, but suppression, emotional suppression is something that actually lawyers, particularly more male lawyers than female lawyers, but not by much. Suppression is something that lawyers usually can use as a tool to eliminate or try to eliminate the emotions at bay. So that's sort of like compartmentalization, is that you move them to a side. The problem with that is that it requires what we call emotional labor. The good news is if you're using emotional labor in a short-term setting, a day 2, 3, 4 of negotiation, but if it's how you live your life, where you emotionally suppress how you're feeling, it interferes tremendously with your effectiveness. So I think compartmentalization works. If essentially what you're saying is to compartmentalize, to put an emotion aside during a particular specific term. Yes, that can be useful. But if it's the way you live, where you don't, you spend all your time, you're angry, but you don't want to feel angry. You don't want people to know you're angry. You don't want to have the consequences of being angry. So you spend a lot of time suppressing that anger. That's not good. It takes so much effort that it's going to take away from your cognitive abilities. It's going to take away from your other abilities. So, yes. Does that answer?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I mean, I think it almost seems like one of the skills or the soft skills around emotional management is knowing how to use it in your life and when and to what degree, it seems.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. And to recognize it again, let's go back to recognizing what are the emotions I'm feeling? Am I accurate about what I'm feeling? Am I accurate? So which ones are actually important to this negotiations and which ones should I move aside?
hmm. If you don't mind taking one more question, there was another interesting question in the chat from Michael Laycock, sort of within the framework of working with lawyers and mediation. Michael, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, it's just how does it work if there's a mismatch between the two lawyers, the parties? One has good emotional perception and the other doesn't.
It's a very good question, and we are going to get to that.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Cheers.
If I don't answer it, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so uh, are emotions important in negotiation? You probably guess where I'm coming from. But let's go back through a few people. This is getting to yes, which is 20-ish years old, but still sort of a textbook that people go to. In negotiation, particularly in a bitter dispute, feelings are more important than talk, can be more important. Actually, they've gotten some pushback in the last 10 years saying that they didn't say strongly enough how important feelings are. Felix Roate, and most deals are 50% emotion and 50% economics, something to think about. Leonard Risk and negotiators, especially those trained in the law, often come to the table with no conscious awareness of their own emotions or ignore or exclude emotions to avoid feeling discomfort. So I'd like to say a few things about this. It's so important to understand our own biases and vulnerabilities. What our feelings personally, again, this is recognizing our own emotions about success, money, justice, the parties involved, the opponents involved. There was a study of doctors, which is very interesting, which said that this is sort of relevant, said that the more emotionally attached or involved doctors were with their patients, the less reliable their predictions of mortality were. So there's just an example of an emotional attachment that screws up your judgment. So we need to really be aware of what our emotions are going into these. The other thing is, let's let's go to this first. High emotional negotiation, better individual outcomes, improved resolution time and rates. We have studies on all this. More lasting rapport with both the client and opponent, and more personally positive experience. So these are all high emotional intelligence participants in negotiations have these better results. I mean, that's on top of good decision making, better relationship building, higher productivity, better able to retain clients, better mental health, physical health. So, but these are just related to negotiation. But what I was saying is that understanding our feelings going into these negotiations and getting to yes again, they suggest that parties' emotions from the start should be made explicit and acknowledged, and I agree with that. There's other studies showing that if you can name emotions out loud, then you're going to quiet the amygdala. So as an example, this is, I can tell you're angry, or it looks to me like you're angry. Let's talk about that. Just saying that lowers the amygdala activity, just acknowledging it out loud. It can be done with, I can see you're upset. Tell me what it is that's bothering you. Now, these are also sort of emotional empathy notes. Um, that's going to improve your relationship with, I don't care who you're talking about, the other opponent, your negotiating opponent, your clients, the two parties when you're a neutral, that speaking the emotions out loud and acknowledge them, not with any kind of censure or judgment, just saying these are what they are. But what's the most common emotion in a negotiation? Of experienced negotiators, what is their most common emotion going into negotiations? Any ideas? David?
I think I know because I read the book. Anxiety.
Yes, yes. The most common emotion is anxiety. Whether there's going to be an agreement, an acceptable one, how they're going to perform, what the other side is like, whether they can get the kind of the deal they're looking for. So this is what the studies say anxiety can do. They restrict our perceptions, they make us more defensive, and they close us down. So that is often read on the other side as deception or hostility, which makes them more aggressive, and then so you have this spiraling problem. But the studies say that this is what anxious negotiators do. They set lower expectations for the outcome. They make lower first offers. They respond more quickly to offers. They exit negotiations earlier and attain worse individual outcomes. These are behaviors that are not necessarily associated with other negative emotions. So this is one we really have to look for, and this is in that management of emotions area. Yes, we feel anxious going into this negotiation. If we can identify what some of those emotions that are making us anxious, if we can lower our own state, talking to ourselves about, I feel anxious, that's very important because an anxious negotiator is not working at the top of their game. So what are some of the negative emotions that go on? There's again studies about this. Anger, frustration, fear, all of these cloud our judgment. They will actually escalate the conflict. They reduce the trust and harm relationships. Can lead others to be aggressive and irrational. And it can keep you from identifying and addressing the underlying issues because there's so much effort going into responding to or reacting to these negative emotions. In getting to yes, one of the things they say is if your counterpart has an explosive emotional event, let them have it. Don't react to it. And then just go on. Again, you don't want those emotions to be the ones that are contagious. I might also say here, there's a lot of research in leadership work, and I talk about it with law firms and law departments, that there are two traits that make for the most effective leaders in the sense of they're most influential. The first one, the most influential, is surprisingly enough warmth. Warmth over competence, which is for lawyers, it can be sort of hard to hear. But that's what the research says, is that warmth is more influential as a leadership skill than competence. Competence is important, and it is a little bit further down the line, but warmth. So it's important to for example, I think it was Getting to Yes. They talk about, no, this is a separate study, that if you have high power negotiator and a lower power negotiator, if the higher power negotiator starts out with anger, they may be benefited by that. But if the lower power negotiator starts out with anger, they're likely to be punished by the higher power one. So that's another consideration about negative emotions. You sort of analyze who's got the power, because you can be in a more negative situation. Then there's positive emotions, not to be Pollyannish about this, but again, we go back to this concept of emotional contagion, of high influence. Things like good humor, compassion, positivity, appreciation, optimism, uh, they produce better problem solving, more creativity, better collaboration. We do have studies saying it's better to start a negotiation in a good mood and then get angry than the reverse. Don't start in an angry mood and then get nice. Starting in a positive mood and then going negative, you're likely to realize all the monetary benefits of simply starting angry, but you'll also keep your negotiating partners from disliking you, where they might retaliate. So this, again, this initial emotion might be contagious, which is a good thing if you can get that going. Other thing I'd say about positive emotions, which is a whole nother discussion, but there was a study of 104 careers about what makes people successful in those careers. It's done by University of Pennsylvania psych professor Martin Seligman. And he was going to write a book about what makes you in all these professions. He wrote the book, but he only wrote about one profession, which was lawyers. And that's because he found in all the other professions, you could have all sorts of attributes and still be successful. But for lawyers, the key attribute to success was, any idea? Pessimism. And we can see in the constellation of traits around that. So we can see how that, seeing what's the worst thing that can happen, being able to assess that down the road is a very important skill for lawyers. You got to be careful, though, that it doesn't infect everything. There are some times when it's a good thing to be optimistic, or a good thing to be good-humored, as opposed to this is never going to go anywhere and I have no ability to affect this, and all the sort of pessimistic things that you might tell yourself in a negotiation. Just take a minute or two, because I want to get on to how to build some of these. You would think one of the positive emotions would be confidence. But we have some bad news on that. Randall Kaiser, who's with Decision Set, did a lot of research with a lot of litigators in litigation and found that in 61% of cases where they had refused settlement offers, those offers were more lucrative for plaintiffs than what they ended up getting at trial. So that talks to us about the confidence, and these were people who felt confident they'd do better at trial. A very similar survey showed that lawyers who were most confident were also the most likely to fail to reach their minimum goal in litigation. And this was despite law schools, standing in law schools, numbers of years in practice and that sort of thing. So you have to be careful. We want to be positive, but we not want to be overconfident. And again, an attribute that lawyers sometimes are stuck with is being arrogant, which is not a good look when it comes to assessing situations. So how do I raise my personal emotional intelligence? And this is a lot we'll just talk about quickly, because I think we have about 5 minutes to talk about this. This is something your mom probably said you should count to 10. The reason that's a good idea is, remember, it takes 6 seconds for those neurochemicals to saturate your body. You've got to let that pass so that your prefrontal cortex can snap into place, and you can actually think with the emotional data and the cognitive data as to what's the best thing to do. For that inability to accurately recognize emotions, this is one I like. You're on planes, you're bored at home, if you mute the TV and watch it or movies, see if you can track what's going on without sound. No words. You do it by expressions, by this is a really good exercise. It will help you perceive emotions. Check in every once in a while. Am I on the right track? Um, Another thing to do is to find an EI buddy, which I really encourage. This could be a spouse, it could be someone at another firm, it could be, but it's just someone you feel is pretty good at assessing these situations, pretty good at knowing how to maneuver, and can be someone that you can say, "This is what so and so said or did. What do you think about that?" And it gives you an advantage because we're all trapped by our own um, biases. Another thing is to be curious. I mean, this sounds sort of simple, but um, there's a whole literature around this particular notion so that it helps check yourself by saying, it seems to me that you are angry about such and such, or it seems to me that you're surprised. And you just check in, is that correct? Did I read that right? It's not a bad thing, and people are usually appreciative of you actually wanting to be correct in your assessment, and it'll help educate you. Oh, that look was not one of disdain. It was actually a look of surprise, it'll help you. Be curious, ask those questions. The other thing is track and name emotions. We all tend to have a very limited vocabulary when it comes to emotions, sort of angry, sad, happy. Uh, Start trying to refine that vocabulary. There's annoyance, there's irritation, there's solicitousness. There's a lot of, and there's combinations of emotions. There's a emotion wheel you can look up that gives you dozens of emotions on uh, in relation to each other. Practice mindfulness. There's good research on this when it comes to negotiation. Those who have used mindfulness, and by that, I mean, Daniel Goleman says it's 5 minutes a day. It's just like going to the gym for your muscles. It's your emotional muscles. What that means is you take 5 minutes, you can be running, you can be sitting, you can be lying down, however and what happens is you let the river of emotions that you're experiencing pass in front of you and let it go. You can acknowledge, this is how I feel, but you let it go. And the reason that's so important is because when you're feeling those in a negotiation or before, when you're feeling those inappropriate or extraneous emotions, you want to be able to let them go. And that's where that comes from, is practicing mindfulness. Can't say enough about that. Can't say I do it enough, but I can't say enough about it as a practice. Try the third person perspective. That's similar to sort of finding an EI buddy. If somebody else said this to me instead of me saying it to them, what would I think? How does a third person think about this? It'll help clear out some of those personal biases. Change how you feel. You can change your emotions. That goes back to the physiological aspects. And you probably heard this. I used it for a long time. If you have a smile on your face for the first hour of the day, you're going to have a better day. It's really where this comes from. If you can sort of help your physical body change some of those tensions and that sort of thing, you're likely to be able to change your emotions. And then finally, to use positivity. I said a lot of that about that already, about why that's important. We talked about warmth, radiating your emotions. Yeah. So where are we on questions now?
We've got about 5 minutes left for questions, and I wondered if you wanted to come back to Michael Laycock's question about
Yes.
people with different emotional intelligence.
Yes, Michael, come back to me again.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you've covered some of it, obviously, in what you've just enumerated. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So you were
Yeah.
asking about what happens when you're the high emotional intelligence or high perception negotiator, and the other person is the low perception negotiator.
Yep, that's one example. I mean, you covered it a bit, but
Right. So, I mean, some things is you're going to be able to manage and frankly manipulate the emotions in the negotiations better. If they fly off, you let them fly off. If they don't recognize the issues that you think are important, you use logic but you do it calmly and firmly. You don't fly off unless into anger or hysterics, unless possibly you have the much higher leverage, then you could argue that that's might might help you. But you can't really change somebody else's emotional intelligence. All you can do is consistently act appropriately. And when you do that, your own clients and their clients are more likely to recognize you as the leader, as the trendsetter. They're going to see if they fly off or if they misdiagnose. They're going to see those things happen in real time. And you just have to stay with your not hysterical, not emotional, but arguing over and over. Like, people are much more appreciative of that than you realize. And also that emotional intelligence piece about asking, what is it? You ask this person, what is it that, and I don't know what they've done, but if they've missed an issue, why are they not concerned about the XYZ issue? So asking questions.
yeah, no, so
Hard to sort of talk about without a specific example, but
yeah, so the mindfulness is generally an advantage then to have.
oh, definitely. Because
Yeah.
you're going to be reacting to people who don't have control and don't have regulation and don't have. So the mindfulness sets you up to be in a position where you're not going to fly off the handle.
Right.
Maybe even, I mean, justifiably in your mind, but the mindfulness is a big help.
You know,
Right.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
taught law school
Ah,
for 20 years. I became a lawyer very late. I became in my 30s, and I taught law school substantially later than that. And I taught negotiation and mediation. And I was very worried about my students. I mean, if you think about it, from the day they start law school, all it is apply the facts to law, the law to the facts. They have
right,
no idea whether Hadley and Baxendale ended up in the hospital. They don't really care. It's irrelevant to the decision of the court. And
right.
by the time they were 3L and in my class, they had whatever empathy ripped out of them by the law school. And they,
Yes, actually, that's what the studies show, that emotional intelligence of lawyers goes down during law school, while emotional intelligence of doctors goes up during medical school. So you're quite right that it goes down during law school.
and also ethics go down during law school.
Yes, and they're related. Emotional intelligence and ethics are related. Partly is that emotional empathy piece, but they are related. I've done whole sessions just on ethics.
And so I created something called coffee.
Huh?
In their logs, if they said something that caused me pain, that I was worried about them, I said, it's good time to have coffee.
Hmm.
And I would go out with the kids and we would have coffee and we would talk it through. And I had a whole list of therapists, work with people that I could send these kids to. The worst thing, the worst evaluation of me that I ever got was finally I met a professor who cared about me. This is a real problem facing law
Yes,
schools.
yes.
They don't get it. And I am very, very worried because with artificial intelligence and other kinds of things, eating at the stuff that kids used to do for first year and
Yes.
with fewer opportunities, the anxiety is going to increase. And so
Yes.
to the extent that you have a mouthpiece, which I do not have, could write something about this, this would be a wonderful gift, because that is the challenge that law schools are facing and they don't know it.
Well, one problem is that unlike you, my hat's off to you, most law school professors have the same profile as most lawyers,
Absolutely.
which is, but some of the good news is that parts of my book have been taught for short times in 2 different law schools, and I've just been approached by somebody who's talking about putting together a program, like more like a workshop, you know, for lawyers. I've spoken to Yale, and I mean, I've spoken to a number of these law schools. The question is whether the administration, you know, not a single law school in the country gives emotional intelligence assessments to their professors. Not a single one. It's done in most corporations. Business schools require emotional. Law schools do not, and law school professors are not given. So we actually have no reason to believe that these people are able to connect with or teach in a way consistent with it. But my hat's off to you. Thank you for what you've done.
Well, it's serious. Kids bring to me problems that other professors have said to them, and I am just stunned that
In a not very long ago, maybe I think it was 2019, before before COVID, they did a survey of Yale law students. 70% said that they had to consult mental illness professionals. 70%.
that
of the
doesn't
Yale.
bother me. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is 70% who don't.
Well, you're right. You're right. Actually, a lot of them said they couldn't go to somebody sort of on record because they were afraid it would affect their careers.
It's such an important topic, and I'll just jump in to say, we are at the top of the hour, and so thank you so much for your talk, Rhonda. It was really fantastic. Thank you to all of our audience members for their contributions. It's a wonderful dialogue at the end, especially to really raise awareness within the community around the importance of these topics. And I think that the fact that you're out there doing this work, and that folks on this panel are attuned to this work is really sort of a hopeful thing for our profession. And again, thank you to everyone who participates, for everyone who donated. I'll just remind you to please send us a note or a message to Natalie letting us know what you've contributed so we can keep track of our running total. These wonderful presentations will be available online for a little while for folks to revisit them. And thanks everyone for attending. And Rhonda, thank you again so much for such a wonderful and important presentation. It's our
Thank you
pleasure.
for having me.
David, this was terrific. Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Mayor.
Sure.